They say they never understood you, but the truth is, they never tried. From the very beginning, every word you spoke was filtered through the noise of their own importance. You were speaking to them, not for attention, but for connection. Yet all they ever did was wait for their turn to speak. Your voice, your feelings, your truths. They floated in the room like whispers in a storm, swallowed by their need to be right, to be seen, to be the center. You weren't in a conversation, you were in a performance, and you didn't even know it. Every time you tried to explain yourself, they nodded without hearing. Every time you opened up, they redirected it back to themselves. You thought if you could just say it clearly enough, they would finally understand, but they didn't want understanding. They wanted validation, control, applause, and when you stopped clapping, they stopped listening. This is not a story about communication. It's a story about awakening, about realizing that no matter how loud you spoke, they only ever heard themselves. The echo chamber of the self. Absorbed, they never truly heard you because they were never truly with you. Not emotionally, not mentally, not even spiritually. Every time you opened your mouth, they were already preparing their reply. Not listening, not absorbing, not caring. You see, people like this live in an echo chamber made by their own design. Every sound that reaches them is twisted into an echo of their own voice. Even your pain was reinterpreted to make them the victim. Your joy, threatening, your silence, disrespectful. They only hear what protects their illusion. That's why you could sit across from them, pouring your heart out, and somehow they'd make it about them. You could say, "I'm hurting," and they'd respond, "Are you saying I'm the cause?" Suddenly, you're the one explaining, apologizing, walking on eggshells. Why? Because they never came to understand. You were just a mirror, and the moment your reflection no longer served their ego, they shattered it. This is the tragedy of the self, absorbed. They're not in relationships, they're in projections. They don't see you as a person with your own thoughts, your own needs, your own story. No, they see you as a supporting character in a play they wrote, directed, and starred in. The irony, you gave them more grace than they ever gave themselves. You listened, you were present, you tried to build a bridge where they kept constructing walls. And yet, somehow, you were always the one misunderstood, misquoted, misrepresented. They loved the idea of being listened to, but never practiced the art of listening in return. In truth, people who live in echo chambers are terrified of silence. Real silence, not the kind where words stop, but the kind where truth enters. Silence threatens their carefully built illusions. That's why the moment you try to speak authentically, they turned up the volume of their own narrative, louder and louder until your voice disappeared into the fog. And what did they do then? They told others you never communicated. They blamed you for shutting down, not realizing it was they who closed the door first. You weren't quiet because you had nothing to say. You were quiet because nothing you said mattered to them unless it praised, pleased, or served. So now you know, they only ever heard themselves. Every conversation was a stage. Every question was rhetorical. Every pause, a space to reload their opinion, not to absorb yours. You could have spoken in poetry or screamed in pain. It would not have changed a thing. Because to hear someone, you must first value them, and they only ever valued their own voice. But here's the quiet power. One day, when your silence grows louder than their noise, they will realize they lost something rare. Someone who truly listened, someone who truly cared, and by then, you'll be far beyond the reach of their echo. The art of selective hearing. You spoke clearly, honestly, from a place of raw truth, but they only heard what suited their comfort. That's the cruel brilliance of selective hearing. It's not that they didn't hear you, it's that they chose not to. They picked your words like fruit from a tree, keeping only what sweetened their self-image and discarding everything that challenged it. You could tell them, "This hurt me," and they would respond with, "So you think I'm a terrible person?" They hijacked the conversation and made themselves the victim in your pain. You were not having a dialogue. You were trapped in their defense mechanism. And the more vulnerable you became, the more filtered and distorted your message sounded in their ears. Your voice was too real, too unfiltered, too inconvenient. So they repackaged it into something easier to dismiss. People like this hear what affirms them, not what confronts them. It's not a flaw in their ears, it's a failure in their character. They listen not to understand, but to scan for anything that might bruise their fragile sense of superiority. You thought that if you worded things gently, they'd receive it. You hoped that if you stayed calm, they'd hear the emotion behind your words, but you forgot one truth. Someone who doesn't want to see you will never truly hear you. And if your truth exposes a part of them they're not ready to face, they'll twist your words into weapons and make you the aggressor. It becomes a cycle, where your every effort to connect turns into ammunition for their denial. And slowly you begin to question your own clarity. Did I say it wrong? Was I too emotional? But no, you were clear, you were brave. It was their ears that were closed. Selective hearing isn't just about what they ignore, it's about what they amplify. Every mistake you made, remembered in full detail, every word you fumbled, replayed endlessly, but your apologies forgotten, your growth overlooked, your intentions always under suspicion. They held on to your worst moments like trophies, but forgot the countless times you extended grace. That's the imbalance of selective perception. They forgive themselves instantly, but keep you on trial forever. And here's what stings the most. They'll claim you're too sensitive, too intense, or too difficult, simply because you refuse to shrink into silence. But there's nothing wrong with being honest. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be heard fully, not edited. What's wrong is pretending to be in a relationship, friendship, family, or love, while only giving the illusion of listening. So let them say what they want. Let them filter, twist, dismiss, because in time they'll come across someone who speaks just like you did, honestly, directly, soulfully, and maybe then they'll realize what they lost. Someone who didn't just speak to be right, but to be real, and by the time they understand that, your silence will have said everything they refused to hear. The battle between connection and control, they could have chosen connection, but they chose control. Every conversation became a competition, not of ideas but of dominance. You weren't speaking to a listener, you were speaking to a fortress. Every word you said was met with resistance, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't surrender. You see, people like this don't engage to understand, they engage to maintain control. They interrupt, correct, condescend, or stay eerily silent, not because they lack interest, but because they need the upper hand. To them, vulnerability is weakness, and openness is a threat. That's why, when you tried to meet them with truth, they met you with power. It was never about understanding, it was about winning. And so, they kept the conversation shallow, predictable on their terms. The moment you tried to dive deeper, they shifted the subject, dismissed your concerns, or painted you as too emotional, too complicated, too dramatic. Because real conversation, the kind where hearts are exposed and truths are shared, requires surrender. It requires admitting, maybe I was wrong, or I didn't realize that hurt you. But to someone obsessed with control, those words are terrifying. They can't say them, not because they can't feel remorse, but because they fear what surrender would do to their image. They wear certainty like armor, even when they're hurting inside, even when they know they caused harm. And when you try to bring honesty to the table, they bring a shield. You didn't ask them for perfection. You asked them to be present, to show up, not with answers but with empathy. But control doesn't understand empathy. It only understands leverage. That's why they often turn things around on you. Made you feel guilty for being honest. Made you feel unstable for expressing confusion or frustration. And somewhere along the way, you stopped bringing things up. Not because the issues disappeared, but because their reactions punished your honesty. That's how control wins. It doesn't silence with violence. It silences with patterns, with sighs, with judgmental looks, with subtle ridicule disguised as just being honest. And in those tiny moments, 1,000 connections are lost. The irony, you would have followed someone who was willing to lead with love. You would have forgiven, compromised, adapted, but they made everything a battlefield. Even the smallest disagreements turned into proof of your disloyalty, your disrespect, your defiance. So you learned to pick your battles until you realized you were the only one fighting for the relationship, and they were only fighting to control it. But the day you stopped engaging in their war, something changed. You stopped needing to be heard by someone who only wanted to win, and in that quiet you found your peace. You stopped debating, explaining, defending, not because you lost, but because you finally understood true connection can only exist where control does not. And someone who sees your honesty as a threat is not someone you owe another conversation to. The invisible scars of being ignored it doesn't always start with shouting. Sometimes the deepest wounds are carved in silence, in the spaces where your voice was supposed to matter but didn't. You sat across from them, trying to express what was breaking inside you, and they looked away, or changed the subject, or offered a hollow nod, just enough to appear present, but never enough to make you feel seen. That's the cruelty of emotional neglect. It's invisible. It leaves no bruises, no traces, only echoes of words that were never caught, never held, never honored. And you left those conversations feeling smaller every time. Not because you lacked the words, but because your words landed in a room where no one was really listening. They made you feel unreasonable for wanting to be heard. They made it seem like your emotional needs were too much, too dramatic, too inconvenient. So, slowly, you started shrinking. You learned which topics were safe, which truths had to stay hidden, which parts of yourself were simply not welcome. You became a version of yourself that walked on emotional eggshells, not because you were fragile, but because you knew that even your strongest words would collapse against the wall of their indifference. That's how these scars form, in the constant, subtle message that says, you don't matter here, not the real you, not the one with messy feelings, not the one with hard questions, not the one who cries quietly behind closed doors wishing, just wants to be truly heard. What hurts more than being rejected is being ignored. Rejection is loud, it's clear, but being ignored is confusing. It keeps you guessing. It makes you doubt yourself. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I need to toughen up. No, you were not too much. They were just too unwilling to show up with the compassion your heart deserved. The worst part, they'll claim everything was fine. They'll point to their presence, their routine gestures, the fact that they were there. But what they don't understand is that showing up physically means nothing when your soul feels completely alone in their company. You don't forget those moments, you carry them. They echo in new relationships. They whisper doubt even when someone is genuinely trying to listen. That's what emotional neglect does. It haunts your confidence. It teaches you that love is something you must earn by staying quiet, by making yourself smaller, by not being too real. But the truth, the people who love you will want to hear you, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's real, because that's what love does. It listens, it leans in, it makes space. So no, you weren't too much. You were just in a place too small to contain your truth. And now, as you heal, you begin to understand those invisible scars. They were not signs of weakness. They were the price you paid for trying to be honest in a world that only wanted your silence. But you're done shrinking, you're done whispering, because your voice was never the problem. It just deserved a better audience. When you finally stop explaining, there comes a moment, not out of bitterness, not out of anger, but out of clarity. When you finally stop explaining yourself, not because you've run out of words, but because you realize they were never listening in the first place. You see, explanation is an act of hope. It's a bridge you build when you believe someone cares enough to meet you halfway. And for the longest time, you believed that. You believed if you could just find the right words, the right tone, the right timing, they would finally understand how deeply their actions cut. You gave second chances, then third, then silence, thinking maybe that would speak louder, but it never did, because they weren't interested in understanding. They were interested in being right, and so you exhausted yourself. Over and over, you stood at the edge of conversations, handing them the map to your emotions, and every time they folded it, shoved it away, or rewrote it with their own directions. They misunderstood you and then blamed you for the confusion. They twisted your clarity into accusations, your softness into manipulation, your boundaries into betrayal. You weren't just fighting to be heard. You were fighting not to disappear. But one day something shifted. Something clicked, not with them, but within you. You realized you were watering dead soil. You realized no amount of truth can awaken a heart that's already decided you're the enemy. So you stopped, not out of spite, but out of survival. You stopped handing your truth to people who only used it to sharpen their pride. You stopped trying to fix what they kept breaking. You stopped rewriting yourself just to become a version they'd finally accept. And in that silence, something beautiful happened. You heard yourself. You realized how loud your efforts had been, how exhausting it was to explain your worth, your kindness, your intentions to someone who never planned to see them. And now you speak less, but what you say carries more. You no longer waste words on the unwilling. You no longer perform for the approval of the indifferent. Let them say what they want. Let them call you cold, distant, unbothered. They don't understand what it costs to keep explaining your heart to deaf ears. They don't know how heavy it is to constantly translate your soul. But now you know better. Silence is not weakness. It's wisdom. It's what happens when you value your peace over their perception. And if they ever wake up and wonder why you stopped trying, let them sit with the echo of their own neglect. Because you didn't walk away out of rage. You walked away because you finally understood. Real connection doesn't need convincing, and the ones who truly care won't need endless explanations to hear you. They'll meet you in your silence and still understand.